Sometimes the gift of hope is the most important gift of all. This story started because of a conversation U.S. Air Force pilot Gail Halvorson had with some children in Berlin in July of 1948. But first I have to give you a little bit of historical background. You all recall, you're an audience that you remember World War II. Yes. And at the end of World War II, you remember that Germany was split into 4 pieces, one controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, England, and France. Now, the capital, Berlin, was in the Soviet part of Germany, 110 miles inside. So the Soviets said that the other 3 partners in Germany could have access to Berlin using one highway, one railroad line, one river, and 3 flight paths. Each flight path was 20 miles wide. And this continued from the end of the war in 1945 until June of 1948. And it was at this point the Soviets decided they wanted all of Berlin. And they started using the age-old tactic of a blockade. They closed that one highway, the one river, and the one railroad line. The flight paths, they left open. I think that was too much of a push, that they weren't willing to go that far to fight the flight paths. Now, Berlin had 2.2 million people, and they needed 4,500 tons of supply per day. We're talking food, and in the wintertime, fuel. 4,500 tons. And cargo planes at that time could carry less than 10 tons of goods per flight. It seemed like an airlift would be an impossible task. But the Americans and the British decided to take it on. And there was a tremendous rush to get planes and crews and figuring out how you could, and unloading the goods was an issue too. One of the things they did was they put canteen carts out on the airfields and had very attractive young women staff them to keep the unloading crews there and not have them wander off. That was one of the more amusing things they had to do, but it was a tremendous amount of hard work. And that's when this conversation happened. A month after the Berlin airlift started, Gail Halvorson, a U.S. Air Force pilot from Westover Air Force Base in Chicopee, his unit was flying from one of the American air bases. He did 3 flights a day. And he had time off between flights because of the unloading. I mean, unloading 10 tons of material is not trivial. It's not like wheeling your carry-on luggage off by any means. So he was waiting around, and he saw that there were some kids on the other side of a mesh fence. And so he decided to go over and talk to them. I mean, he had flown for the Air Force during World War II, and he had talked to kids in every place where he was stationed. These kids, they asked him different kinds of questions, though. How much flour does your plane hold? How many loaves of bread can be made from that flour? They told him things like, our relatives in East Berlin come over to West Berlin every day to read the newspapers in the libraries here, because the newspapers that are published here have different news in them than the newspapers published in East Berlin. And then there was a little girl. She had wistful blue eyes, and she wore oversized long pants. I assume those were the only pants her family had that came even close to fitting her. Because this was, right after the war. This was a hard time in Germany, let alone being in a blockade. And she said to Gail Halvorson, "We could get by with very little if we knew the Western allies would stick with us and do the best they can." Well, it was time for Gail Halvorson to get back to his plane. He said goodbye and he turned. But as he was walking away, he started thinking, this was different. This was different than any conversation I ever had. I mean, these children were very serious, but there was something. They never asked if I had any candy. Every other conversation he had had with kids, they had always asked for candy. So he checked and he had 2 pieces of gum. There were about 30 children. But he turned and went back and he said, "Here's 2 pieces of gum." Well, they very carefully broke it up into as many pieces as they could, handed those out, and then they ripped the wrappers up so that everyone got something. And Gail watched them smell the wrappers and then tuck the little pieces away for later. He decided, "Tomorrow I'm going to drop some chocolate bars for you." And they all got excited. And then there was this conversation. And then the little girl with the wistful blue eyes and the oversized pants said, "What is the number on your plane so we will know when to look extra special?" And he said, "Oh, I fly a different plane every day." "I know, I'll wiggle my wings." And there was another conversations going on. "What is wiggle?" He said, "Wiggle." And they all went, "Wiggle, jawohl, jawohl." So now he was late, so he said goodbye and rushed off. He told his 2 crewmen about this conversation. When they got back and had finished flying for the day, they pooled together all their ration coupons and went to the PX and got a sizable number of Hershey chocolate bars. So sizable that they felt they had to split them up into 3 bundles because they could actually hurt somebody if it fell on them. And they decided to make parachutes out of handkerchiefs, one for each of those 3 boxes, to again, be sure that they didn't hurt anyone. Well, their first flight in, the children weren't there, so no boxes were sent out. But the second time they flew in the next day, there were the children waiting behind the mesh fence. So Gail flew over there. One of his crewmen pushed the 3 boxes out, and they didn't see what happened because, you're kind of busy when you're landing a plane. But when they were taxiing off, they saw the kids, and the 3 parachutes were being waved. One of them by the little girl with the wistful blue eyes and the oversized pants. Well, Gail and his crew kept on doing this without any permission. And it was wonderful. The same day that his commander found out what he was doing and was going to call him in to ream him out for... It made the press. It was a wonderful newspaper article about, isn't this a wonderful way to help the relationships between the Americans and the Germans? So the commander, I would have been very angry, except my bosses are very happy. So lots of pilots and crews started doing this. And it made the news in Germany. It made the news over here. It made the news in Chicopee. Now, the secretary to the mayor had been in the Air Force during World War II, and he suggested, why don't we have the children in Chicopee help make these parachutes and tie Hershey bars to them? This is not a real Hershey bar. Do not get excited. And so that that was brought to the community. There was a women's college in Chicopee. They took the leadership. They went into school classrooms. They had special activities on Saturdays in firehouses and other places. The children of Chicopee made 40,000 parachutes. Yes. And other people around the country helped too. Well, the Berlin airlift lasted for 15 months. There was a total of 277,000 flights in those 15 months, an average of 600 flights a day. They brought in 2.3 million tons of food and fuel. I can't put my mind around that, no. But the 600 flights, I can. And unfortunately, it had been a very foggy winter during those 15 months, and 65 lives were lost during the Berlin airlift. But the Germans remember this. In 1960, when JFK was in Berlin, one of the men in his entourage was General Lucius Clay, who was the one who organized the Berlin airlift and got the men who had been working with airlifts in India during World War II. He had them transferred there because they knew how to do things. And one of those guys was the one who said, well, the unloading crews won't go away if we have the canteen trucks there with the pretty German Frauleins. And many other logistical things. When General Lucius Clay's name was announced that day when Kennedy was there, the crowd in Berlin went wild. They knew his name. And monuments have been built. There were, on those 3 air paths, there were 3 fields that were involved in the airlift, and they built a partial arch. In Germany, they talked about this as a bridge, that this was an air bridge that had been made from Western Germany into West Berlin. And so on those 3 air bases, they have partial arches, and they have the matching arch in Berlin. And on each of those monuments, they have the names of the 65 men who were killed. They remember. Now, when I went to Chicopee to research this story, I spoke with the town historian, and he told me he was one of those children who made these. So I said, what do you remember? He said, not much. Not what you want to hear when you're researching a story. He said, I remember we had a map of Germany on the wall in our classroom, and the 3 flight paths were shown there. And I remember that after each afternoon when we made the parachutes, we each got a Tootsie Roll. But there was a reunion 50 years after the end of the Berlin airlift. Gail Halverson went to it. Oh, I forgot. I forgot something. Oh, I'm not supposed to say that. What you need to know now is, Betty McCanty told me that that line. Before I end the story, what you need to know now is that thousands of thank you letters were sent to Gail Halverson, and some of them were available in the archives of the Chicopee Library. And I took photographs of them, and then a storytelling friend of mine who's English but teaches English in Germany, I sent them to him, and he had his classes translate them for me. So this is one of those letters that was only translated because I was there, and I knew somebody who knew kids who wanted to do this. Lieber Schokoladenflieger, dear chocolate flyer. Gail Halverson was known as the candy bomber, which I thought was, killing with candy. I don't quite like that. But chocolate flyer, or Schokoladenflieger in particular, I like a lot. We want to thank you most warmly for your sweet gifts. The bars were joyfully received by all the children. especially the younger children who had never eaten chocolate before. They were completely overwhelmed by the taste. Before, chocolate had been just a dream. Of course, you can buy chocolate, but don't ask how much it costs. Most parents can't scrape enough money together to buy a bar for their children. As much as we were afraid of the American flyers during the war, so much glad we are now to see them, as they are securing our food during the Soviet blockade. So during this reunion in Berlin, Gail Halverson met one of the formerly young men who had received one of these. Instead of, they had just one chocolate bar at a time. They would jettison a whole bunch of these from planes. This formerly young man said, "I was 10 years old, walking to school on a cloudy day, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was this parachute with a chocolate bar, a fresh chocolate bar from America. I was very surprised, but it wasn't the chocolate that was important. It was that someone outside of my blockaded city knew the trouble that we were in. It wasn't chocolate. It was hope. Sometimes the gift of hope, no matter how it's delivered, is the most important gift of all."